people of God, today is a special day for us. Always has been, always will be. It is a day of fond remembrance and quiet reflection. I was a little shattered yesterday when I went to Checkers for my dose of hot cross buns. I better not tell you how many I bought. I was a little shattered to learn that they will be trading today from 8 in the morning till 8 this evening. And ever since I spoke to that cashier, I have been wondering what has happened, not only to this world, but to this country. Is it really impossible for us to just set one day aside to reflect and to contemplate? I then realized that 2,000 years ago in the busy streets of Jerusalem, as Jesus was carrying his cross through the marketplace to outside the city, the venue of his crucifixion, nothing stopped. And so there will always be the tension between us as believers and the world. We are here because we care, because this day is sacred to us who believe, and we come to this place to worship the crucified Christ. I welcome you into this special place. I'm going to read to us from Matthew chapter 27, where the heading is the crucifixion. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed the written charge against him, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said. He saved others, but he cannot even save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine and vinegar and put it on a stick and then offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now let's leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. I needed a title for this morning's sermon, and the best I could come up with was The Theology of Trials and Temptations, Tests and Tribulations. If only there was an escape from our worry or our doubts. If only we could once and for all eradicate uncertainty from our lives. If only our bodies could learn how to adjust to pain, perhaps, then we would have heaven on earth. Can you, just for a microsecond, imagine a world without any pain, without any suffering, without any disease, without any death? Just imagine, if it's at all possible, for a second or so, a perfect world. Whether this kind of world is possible, only God would know. For God, our Creator, seems to insist on letting our free will prevail. And in a world where free will stands up for grabs, there will always be the consequences of badly exercised free will. It looks like God gave us free will out of love and refuses to take it away because He is love. It was Daniel Erlander in his book Manna and Mercy wrote the opening line, which goes as follows: "We have been made in love, by love, for love, to love, and yet with the option not to love in return." The dilemma, of course, is that in a fallen world, in this world which is so far from perfect, there is heart-wrenching pain and unimaginable suffering. We don't get spared it at all. There are a few words in the English vocabulary which evoke such deep, profound emotion in me as the word Calvary. For every time I hear this word, it evokes in me some kind of real response, some kind of real reaction, for I know exactly what crucifixions were like. Not only because of what I read in Scripture, but also because I studied some Roman history. And I know exactly the extent to which the Romans went to town to make these terrible executions as awful and as horrible as possible. We know that crucifixions only became popular in art once all those who had forgotten what crucifixions were like firsthand had all died out. Every bit of Roman art that we have available to us was created, designed, and invented only after those who had beheld crucifixions firsthand were no longer around. It was the most unspeakable way of dying. So much so that the Romans never took the risk of performing it on one of their own citizens. This is why Paul was so lucky. St. Paul, as a Roman citizen, ended up being beheaded, while St. Peter, who wasn't a Roman citizen, ended up being nailed to a cross. It was too inconceivable for somebody who belonged to the Empire of Rome to end their lives in such a shameful, humiliating, agonizing way. So whenever I hear the word Calvary, whenever I read it in the Bible or hear it in a song, I find myself jolted into remembering exactly what Christ did for us. For out of the choices he had, he chose the nails, the spear, the purple robe, and the crown of thorns. Calvary itself wasn't a happy place. Not only is there the possibility that it could have been in the shape of a skull, having earned for itself that very name, because of the form as it was looked at from a distance. But there's also a theory that it was named Golgotha in Hebrew, the place of the skull, because there were lots of skulls lying around on the ground from previous crucifixions, which of course would have made this site very eerie and very macabre indeed. Whenever I hear the word Calvary, my heart becomes filled with tearful wonder. For I know exactly the price that was paid on my behalf. Although the pain we go through often does not equal that of Jesus, our own pain that we face in this broken world can sometimes make us feel as if we are facing our very own lesser Calvary. I've been through some harrowing Calvary experiences in my life. And I know that because you are human, you know precisely what I'm talking about. The Calvary that stands out in my mind is, more often than not, my Calvary of 2009, when my friend and colleague minister at St. John's Methodist Church in Port Elizabeth drowned. I was there at P.E. Harbour at the time when his body was taken, his lifeless body was taken out of the sea. At that moment, I was so indescribably devastated that I was convinced that I would never laugh again. Now, for those in my congregation, you're getting to know me and you know that I'm somebody who loves to laugh. But on that day, on the 2nd of September 2009, I was absolutely persuaded that for the rest of my life, I would never laugh again. And maybe you have tasted some of that in your Calvary experience. Maybe you have been through some stuff where you have found yourself in exquisite, extraordinary pain, where you thought that for as long as you breathe, you will never, ever laugh again. Perhaps your Calvaries look different to mine, but perhaps they are Calvaries nonetheless. Maybe you have faced in your life the Calvary of disappointment. Or dare I say, the Calvary of rejection. Or maybe you have tasted the bitter Calvary of losing a loved one, either after a long sick bed, or perhaps unexpectedly. I really don't know which is worse. Perhaps your life has been shocked and horrified by having to face the murder of a dear one. Or somebody having died in a car accident. Or can I take the risk of saying a suicide? These are all Calvary experiences that are part of this imperfect life we live. The question which freezes in mid-air today would be this: what is your Calvary? Is it a divorce that has been heavily carried on your back? Or is your life being tortured by loneliness or crippled by depression? Maybe you are stumbling underneath the heavy weight of a failure, which is like a ghostly Calvary, never allowing you to be free. Or maybe your heart is seeping tears because there's a regret that just has got its cold grip on you and it's not letting go. Or perhaps you are drinking from a poisonous cup, the one caused by addiction or an obsession. You don't have to tell me. You can answer this question in private. What is the Calvary you are facing? I came here this morning to tell you this, that no matter what you have been through, no matter what you currently are going through, I've come here to tell you that your God is not far away. But that God in some sacred manner understands your Calvary. For God knows all about Calvary. For it was on Calvary, that scary place outside Jerusalem, that stony hill outside the ancient city of David, where God poured out all He had so that pain would not defeat us and so that death would not kill us. As theologians, we talk about the kenosis of God. It's Greek. It's a word which means the outpouring of, the self-emptying of. And this is exactly what we witness on Calvary, the kenosis of Jesus, the self-emptying of God, God giving up everything so that we could find a meaningful life. In Charles Wesley's hymn, "And Can It Be That I Should Gain?" there's one very moving line which says, Christ emptied Himself of all but love. God is with you in your Calvary simply because God has been there Himself. Jesus, the Son of God, on the cross, in indescribable agony, becomes the archetype, Philip Yancey says in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace. Philip Yancey says that why we are so drawn to Calvary, why we are so fascinated by the tortured Christ, is because He becomes the archetype of every human sufferer. That in Christ God is able to relate in every person, to every person who has ever lived. In Jesus, God identifies with every rape victim. In Jesus, God identifies with every abused woman and every molested child. In Jesus, God identifies with every person who's ever been brutalized or dehumanized. In Jesus, God identifies with every person who has ever cried. With every person who's ever been tortured, with every person who's ever been executed unfairly, with every person who's ever spilt innocent blood unjustly. God is not the kind of God who looks at earth from His jacuzzi in heaven and says to Himself, gosh, I feel so sorry for those folks down there. They've really made a mess of things. I'm going to go on a long vacay and then come back and start over on Mars. which would have been a comfortable option for God. But no, in Jesus, God does exactly the opposite. God dives right into our deprivation, and God says, I will grow with you. Rather than stay separate in some kind of steel box, I will become a part of your mess. I will become a part of your corruption. I will go through your sorrow. God bleeds with us, and God grieves with us, and God understands our devastation. Maybe this whole thing of a God in pain doesn't. I have a funny feeling that what I'm saying is comforting a whole lot of you, but there might be the mavericks in our midst saying, then I'm not touched by this whole thing of a God bleeding to death. It doesn't sit lekker with me. Of all the religions in the world, as far as I know, we are the only ones who exalt the humiliation of our God. And that makes all the difference. Perhaps you are somebody who would be more impressed by God exerting power, like God playing marbles with the planets in the universe, telling the sun, the moon, and the stars where to go, and maybe a God who does a couple of miracles just to show off. That's what he did in Jesus, after all. He made the lame to walk, and the blind to see, and the deaf to hear, and then just for good measure, he also raised a couple of people from the dead. That's the stuff that wins you over. Maybe that's the stuff that impresses you mightily, not a God who hangs on a cross and then ends up saying, I'm thirsty. But let me tell you what has wrapped itself around my heart. Why I'm so impressed by Calvary. I'm impressed by the fact that while God could have kept himself untouchable, while God could have transcended all human pain and misery, he still opted to go the way of the cross. And if that doesn't impress you, nothing will. A God this big, this powerful, this fancy, seeing a God like this abdicating his power so that love could have the last say, that's just something else. That leaves me gobsmacked and awestruck. I'm pretty sure that God could have saved himself. That God could have chosen a painless way, and that God could have written us off, and God could have obliterated all the sinners on earth, and God could have said, I'm done. I just can't deal with this. But God, rather surprisingly, does exactly what we didn't expect. He immerses himself in the swamp of our tears and says, I'm here, I care, and I understand, and I weep with you. And God has wept for you, good friend, and God has wept for me. And every time we face a Calvary, he's there. Next time you hear the word Calvary, I want it to be more than just a word for you. I want it to be a term that changes your life. Something that reveals God to you. Something that exposes God's heart, if you like. A God who is not separate to our pain, but interested and involved. I always think of a story written by Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his work, The Cost of Discipleship. He was a German pastor in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And of course everybody flocked to him to try and find some answers for their questions, for people's faith was in crisis. One day, some of the prisoners in the concentration camp tried to escape. They got out for a few meters, and then one of the guards saw them, caught them and brought them back, and then had to decide what kind of punishment needed to be executed for them having tried to get away. The German guards got hold of one of the sons of those who tried to escape. A 6-year-old boy. They wanted the punishment to be severe, and they wanted it to be of such a measure that no one would ever again try to escape. The guards crucified the 6-year-old boy. They nailed him to a cross for all to see. People in large numbers came to Dietrich Bonhoeffer saying, "Pastor, tell us what is happening here. How do we explain such wickedness, such brutality? Where was God?" Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a very simple answer, but it was the best he could do. He said, as that little 6-year-old boy was nailed to that cross, God was right there with him being nailed to that cross. God doesn't stand outside our brokenness, but enters fully and completely, proving to us once and for all what his heart is all about. Calvary is the stark proof that God would rather identify with us in a sacrificial way rather than to make a world where free will and its consequences don't exist. For that world would be loveless, and God insists, if on anything, on love. And so if you ask my opinion, I would say that the suffering God is most impressive. It makes all the difference. For on that Good Friday long ago, we find our dreams coming true. All we have ever wanted was a God who loves us as we are, and a God who understands our human plight. And in Jesus, God gives us that. For those 2,000 years ago standing at the cross waiting for a miracle, they didn't realize that they were watching a miracle in front of their very eyes. The cross is the miracle, for it brings God right down to our level of imperfections and fallenness in a suffering world. Calvary, in all its bloody mess, is the miracle, for it teaches us that God is closer to our pain than we think. God sits with us in our tears today and waits for the sun to rise. If we sit quietly this morning in the dust at the foot of the cross, we will hear far away the promise of resurrection, and the honeysuckle whispers are fast approaching life. Amen. Here, as I end my Good Friday service, I play a musical tribute in honor of the Christ. I'm going to do that now, and that will signal the end of the service. As the music ends, there will be no benediction, no greeting, no dismissal. The last chord I play is the closing. So please then leave here in complete silence.